before he passed away, you spent some time with Steve Jobs.
Yep.
And I was hoping you could share with us a little bit of what that conversation was like and its impact on the way you managed the organization.
You know, he was very, very gracious to agree to see me when I first became CEO. I didn't know him, but I knew somebody who knew him, and he said, come on down to the Apple offices, and I went by to see him, and he said he'd give me a half hour and give me a couple of hours. And he taught me a lot in those 2 hours. First, we talked about our mutual love for vegetarianism, because I'm a vegetarian, he was a vegetarian. But once we crossed those basic introductory topics, he asked me what I was interested in making a mark on in PepsiCo, which included things like design, transforming the portfolio. And this is what he said to me: if design is important to you, it has to report to you, because it's a new skill you have to build in the company. If you don't show CEO support for that function, don't even get started on the journey. The other thing he told me, which was unusual for me, because it was just not in my personality to do that, he said, if you really feel strongly about something and you don't like something people are doing, throw a temper tantrum. Throw things around, because people have got to know that you feel strongly about it. And I talked to his agency partners, and they said that if you showed Steve a campaign or showed him a design for a product, and if he didn't like it, he would throw the papers across the room and make them work all night. Now, I haven't gone that far, but I'm beginning to use certain words a little bit more freely, and I am screaming a bit more. When I say screaming, you know, pounding the table and saying, you know, this is a piece of something, go redo it, which, you know, was really not the way I was, but it is effective, because it shows the passion that I have for what I'm doing. He also went through some of my products and told me where I shouldn't change the look and where I should change the look. He'd done the homework. And the last thing, you know, he had a very radically different perspective. He said, reduce the sugar massively in your sodas. I said, Steve, nobody will drink this stuff. He said, you know, he was idealistic. He said, just tell your shareholders they're going to have to wait. I think that's a little bit unrealistic. But, you know, that was the conversation I had with Steve. Well, I tell you, the best couple of hours I spent with him.
So, and this is where where Steve was showing his brilliance. Now, around this time, Next is kind of not working out so well. And I've got a good relationship with Steve, but and all of us do, but we didn't want him there full time. All right, he was really good part time, because he faced outwards and he let us. Excuse me, I keep raining.
Just put on the table, it'll be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're out trying to figure out how to make this movie, and we were a group, though, that had been through failures together. So we'd all experienced that, and it was really difficult to figure this out. And we made a lot of misestimates, and the first versions didn't work very well. But as we got closer, it became apparent that we were onto something really big. And I have to say, John Lasseter believed right from the minute that this was going to be gigantic. But from Disney's point of view, it was a boutique film. So they didn't put any consumer products behind it, because they didn't see it being anything. But as we got into the last year, it was now apparent it was big. And so Steve said, okay, now we are going to revolutionize this industry. But we're also in a position where, because we've got the experience here, not only do we have the first film out, we will probably have the second film out before anybody else can get into this. But the deal that we had with Disney, frankly, was not a very good deal. We got like 3 to 5% of the profit or something like that. So it was not very good. Not very good. So Steve called John and me together, and he said, okay, our deal lasts for 3 pictures, and at the end, we're on our own. Michael Eisner will realize, as soon as this film is successful, that he will have just created his biggest nightmare. So he will not want the contract to end. So when the film comes out, he will renegotiate. And when we renegotiate, I want 50% of the profits. But if we get 50% of the profits, that means we have to put up 50% of the money. So in order for us to put up 50% of the money, we have to have the money in the bank. Therefore, we should go public. So John and I are saying, whoa, 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 this is a little early here. Let's prove our worth first. But Steve, being Steve, had a compelling way about him. So we put on the road show. We went out and showed pieces of the movie. But what he told people as we went on the road show, so I went out with our CFO went with us, Florence Levy, and Steve. And as we went out, the argument was that the company will go public 1 week after the movie opens. So you will see that we're changing the industry. And so that's the prep. So the movie comes out, it opens huge, it gets incredible reviews, and then the next week we go public. And it was the biggest IPO of the year. It was bigger than Netscape.
Incredible.
It was an incredible thing.
Earlier, I spoke to Steve Jobs' co-founder at Apple, Steve Wozniak. I started by asking him what his first memory of Steve Jobs was.
Oh, my first memory was I had designed a computer and was building it in a garage down the street with a friend. And he said, you have to meet this other guy. He went to our high school, and his name is Steve Jobs, and he understands digital electronics, and he also plays pranks at the high school, which I was famous for. So Steve came over, and we met on the sidewalk, as I remember, and we just started asking each other, what did you do? What pranks did you do? And I would tell which ones I did, and then what'd you do? You know, what have you done with electronics? And he built this, and I've designed all these computers, and we just hit it off. And then we merged into other topics that young people are into.
Were you aware that you were with a genius when you were with him?
Well, I was such a genius in computer design that it just overshadowed anything he would do in the technical realm. He was very fast thinking. He had an idea. He wanted to go here. He wanted to go there. He wanted to go there. He was almost driven with a lot of anxiety and hypermotion. And he had great thoughts and he had great thinking. And when we first started Apple, he would often pose very good questions. Why isn't a company organized this way? Why doesn't a certain person do a certain job rather than another person do it? And he was almost always, you couldn't contradict him. He also had this drive to have a role at first. Eventually it would become like power, control, but a role of just having input into every major department and development in the company.
So my favorite Steve Jobs story is one day, I'm in my cubicle, Steve shows up with somebody I never met before, and he asked me, Guy, what do you think of this company called Knoware? Knoware. And I said, well, Steve, it's kind of a mediocre company, mediocre product, a lot of drill-in practice, doesn't take advantage of graphics, not mouse, not color. Just kind of basic mediocrity, nothing that's strategic for us. And he says to me, I want you to meet the CEO of Knoware. So that's what it was like working for Steve Jobs. You always have to be on the ball. My story.
Hi, my name is Randy Adams. I came to California in 1985 where I sold a company doing desktop publishing products, and it did quite well. And some of my friends who worked with me there went to work at Next, and they told Steve Jobs that he should hire me. So I went in for an interview, and I spent some time talking to Steve and the other engineers there. And I went back to my apartment in San Francisco, and I was getting pretty big royalty checks, and I really didn't want to work, so I turned down the job offer. And about 2 days later, my phone rang, and I didn't answer it, but on my message machine was a message from Steve, and he said, Randy, you're blowing it. This is an opportunity of a lifetime, and you have an opportunity to work at Next, and you're blowing it. And I thought, okay, Steve Jobs called me up and told me I'm blowing it. I better take a job at Next. So I went to work at Next. I was fortunate enough to have a little extra cash, and I bought a 911 Porsche, and at the same time Steve bought one. As a matter of fact, we had the same sound system installed. And we'd park together next to each other in 3 parking spaces at Next because we didn't want to get door dings. So we'd park quite far apart. And one day I was working at my desk and Steve Jobs came to me and he said, Randy, we have to move the Porsches. I'm like, why, Steve? And he said, well, Ross Perot is coming and he's going to invest, and I don't want him to think we have a lot of money. So we hid the Porsches in the back of the building, and Ross Perot invested. So I guess it worked.
I have these sort of personal experiences that mean a lot to me. But, geez, there are a couple things that really stand out. Certainly everything he's ever said to me is memorable. He spoke in just the most memorable, just spoken sort of mantra, you know. And well, one of the things he said to me one time, we were having dinner, and he said, just keep showing up to the party. And I just thought that was the greatest thing in the world. And it sums everything up for him, doesn't it? You know, just keep showing up to the party. We had a very loyal relationship. He would always take my call personally, and that scared the crap out of me. So whenever I would call, I would make sure that I had something really to say. And this leads me to how much of a genius he was in that. And I also think it explains a little bit as to why you also get this sort of other narrative about him being tough. So I was standing backstage with him at Macworld one time. And I was a big Mac fan. I actually met him because I cold called him in like 2002 and said, hey, I love Apple. I want to be an Apple guy. I was so nervous. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous. He said, I got a really good bullshit detector, don't worry. And we were friends, and the first offer for me to do a Macworld came in so soon after that. We're standing backstage at Macworld, and I said, okay, Steve, what about a vintage computer with vintage aesthetics, like an old G3 Pismo PowerBook from 1999, which I loved. It's still the best looking PowerBook, right? It looks like Batman's PowerBook. I said, I was very excited too, right? I said, what about an old G3 Pismo PowerBook with all new guts inside of it? Why can't you make that? And he just said like this, because we'd sell 14 of them. And I went, wow, okay. Now imagine that you had been working on that question for a year and a half. Imagine that you had drawings, line drawings, AutoCAD. You had like 3D printed models of things, and you said, tomorrow's the big meeting with Steve, here we go, blah, blah, blah. He'd still say to you, we're only gonna sell 14 of these. And you realize how emotional it can be to present an idea to somebody. That's not the only dumb idea I presented to Steve over the years. And he wasn't, okay, now that time was sort of purposefully sort of just ribbing me, right? But the other times I called up and I had a genuine idea, he wouldn't shoot the idea down necessarily, but he would ask one question that would just shoot the idea down in the very center, from the very center of your idea, the one you actually thought to yourself, this is what's going to make me pick up a phone and call Steve Jobs and say, I have this idea. And he said, why can't they do that at home? Yeah. And then he said, where are you going off to next? I said, Japan. He goes, oh, I know some great sushi places, you know? And so...
He's on Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs was and is a wonderful Silicon Valley icon. Is he someone that you've admired, and what have you learned from Steve's life and work?
Well, he's certainly someone I've admired. Although I did try to talk to him once at a party, and he was super rude to me. But I don't think it was me. I think it was sort of, you know, off the course.
I think you weren't the first.
Yeah, not the first. No, it was. Yeah, and I was actually there with, like, Larry Page is an old friend of mine. I've known Larry since before he got venture funding for Google, and Larry was the guy that introduced me to Steve Jobs. So it's not as like I'm going like and tugging on his coat, like, you know, please talk to me. But you know, so I was introduced by Larry Page. It's not bad. So. I mean, he obviously was an incredible guy and made fantastic products you know, and I don't know, there was like a certain, the guy had a certain magic about him, you know, just sort of, that was really inspiring. So, I mean, I think that's really great.
Is there that magic that you try and emulate?
No, I think Steve Jobs is way cooler than I am, so.
Tell me about the genesis of a book about Steve Jobs.
Well, you know, I'd written about Franklin, had just about finished Einstein, and Steve called me. I'd known him since 1984 when I was at Time Magazine, and we'd see him when he'd come in to show off products. He said, why don't you do me next? And I thought, okay, Franklin, Einstein, Steve Jobs, he thinks he's next in the list. I didn't know he was sick, and I said, look, you got a long career ahead. I'd love to write your bio someday, but let's wait 20 or 30 years until you retire. It was only a few years ago, early 2009, I realized how sick he was and also how he had transformed 7 industries. And so at that point, I was quite eager to do it. And I think he wanted, he's a very private person, very controlling person. And I think he kind of wanted to break out of that and talk and just give his story.
Did you feel like, you sort of gave a nod to it there. Did you feel like it was a measure of his hubris that he would ask you upon finding out that you've done Franklin and Einstein to write a biography about him?
Not really. I actually think he's about as transforming as any person of our time. He's up there with Edison or Walt Disney or Ford. And,
but he recognized that.
Oh, I think that he was not unaware of his own importance.
Right.
Nobody ever said that humility was his top 10 virtues.
To do LSD with Steve Jobs. Can you take me back to those college days? Let's just rewind and go back there.
Let's see, were we playing Sergeant Pepper?
Well, yeah, what were you playing? How did this go down?
It was pretty prosaic. We were in Portland at Reed College. Freshman college year is a very poignant time of life where you're very much trying to figure out what the world is about and what you're interested in.
How'd you guys meet?
Oh, well, at Reed was a pastoral environment, and so there was a lot of hanging out going on. But Steve and I developed a friendship when we figured out that we had both read this amazing book called Be Here Now, which is about psychedelics and spirituality. Steve was my best friend at the time of life when I was discovering all this huge current of Eastern literature. All of a sudden, psychedelics were being introduced into the mix of traditional spirituality, and that was just very fascinating.
Do you remember the first time you guys took psychedelics together?
No, not really. We were just kind of walking around. I think we used to go for hikes. I think we camped out on the beach. I can't really remember building a campfire. I don't remember what we did when it got dark. I can tell you that the times that I was taking psychedelics with Steve, we weren't really talking that much. We were more of in a meditative space.
At some point, you and Steve Jobs, you guys decided to go to India, right?
Yes.
What was that trip like?
I didn't have any money. I had no travel plans, but Steve had started working at Atari and he had money, a couple $1,000s. And so he offered to buy my ticket. And I said, absolutely okay, let's go. We were just traveling around, just hippies traveling around. We weren't even hippies. We shaved our heads. We were monks. We were monk wannabes.
The story goes that everyone's in the garage working on the first prototypes.
When I heard that he was starting this Apple project, that was a big surprise to me, and I volunteered to help, not having any qualifications whatsoever, but I was happy to help. Most of what I was doing was testing these boards and hooking them up and testing. I had to plug all the chips in and then test them. And Steve was on the phone in the kitchen most of the time. So I was alone in the garage. Did I even have a radio? No, I didn't even think I had a radio.
Once you were there, did you and Steve Jobs ever take LSD or continue to take psychedelics?
Once Apple started, Steve was really focused with all of his energy on making Apple successroll. And he didn't need psychedelics for this.
Larry Tesler, I believe you took Steve on a tour of Xerox PARC and showed him some technology that became important. I wonder if you could tell us about that tour.
Well, it wasn't a tour of the physical facility, it was a tour of the software. It was part of that demonstration. Xerox was facing a lot of competition from Asian companies in copiers when their patents expired. And one thing they found was that they had a very high manufacturing cost, and they were really having trouble competing with these new forces in the market. At the same time, they had Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, developing very exciting technologies, including the Ethernet graphical user interface with Windows and improved mice from what existed before. And they started worrying that they would not be able to manufacture those cheaply enough when they moved into that market. So they looked around and saw that Apple was cranking out Apple IIs for really cheap and selling lots of them, and they thought, well, we should partner with a company like Apple, and they'll make our machines for us, something like that. They had some kind of idea of that type. And so some business development people came out from the East Coast to PARC and Apple, and when they got to Apple, they made a deal where in exchange for various business arrangements, distribution and future discussions of manufacturing and so on, Apple would sell them stock, which was a very appealing thing because it was clear Apple was going to have a very successful IPO. So it was either 1 million shares or $1 million worth of stock that they got. And in exchange, though, Steve Jobs required that they get information, a disclosure about everything cool going on at Xerox PARC.
Good bargain.
And nobody checked with the PARC people first, but the business development people signed the deal. And so there were a number of visits. I was involved in a couple of them. One was executives visiting and meeting with some of us, trying to just get information out of us or an agenda for how to get the information out of us. And that was a little bit of a tense meeting. But I remember at one point, Steve was pacing the room, trying not to be in charge of the meeting because he was not the CEO of the company. Mike Scott was. And at one point, he just said, stop, 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 stop. Let's stop this discussion. We need to tell them about the Lisa. And all the Apple people kind of froze. Come on, we need to tell them about the Lisa. This conversation is going to go nowhere. So we all perked up, you know, because it was about us disclosing to them, not them disclosing to us. But finally, they threw up their hands and said, okay, tell them about the Lisa. So somebody told us a little bit about the Lisa, which at that time did not have a graphical user interface. But it was powerful enough to do the kinds of things that they thought we were doing. And the next thing I remember was another meeting where apparently there'd been a demo in between, but they weren't satisfied with the demo. They knew there was a lot more than what we were showing them. There were a lot of people at PARC that didn't want to show them everything. And in fact, we all felt like we didn't want to show them everything, but I was one of those who felt we should show them more. But there were people that wanted to hold back everything we could. So they arranged a new set of demos where more people came. Bill was there, John Couch, Mike Scott, and obviously Steve. Jeff Raskin was there, a couple other people. And the room was pretty full, and there were about 2 or 3 of us from PARC in the room at a time, one person sitting at a computer giving a demonstration, and the other people kind of waiting their turn or observing. So during that demo, Steve again got very excited, and he was pacing around the room and occasionally looking at the screen. He was mostly just looking and then reacting and taking it all in and trying to process it. And at one point, he said, "You're still not showing us everything." And the meeting paused, and there were some phone calls, and, "Okay, we're going to show you more." So I gave my demo, and Dan Ingalls gave a demo of Smalltalk, and they started asking us a lot of questions. Bill and Bruce Daniels was there, too, from MIT. He joined Apple. The technical people were all asking us questions, and we were answering the questions. And frankly, I was amazed. I had looked into Apple earlier, a couple of years before, because someone tried to get me to work there. And I found these people that were homebrew computer club kind of hackers. Suddenly, there were all these computer scientists in the room, and they were asking really good questions. So I got a completely different view about what Apple was like from that meeting. But Jobs was there going, "What is going on here? You're sitting on a gold mine. Why aren't you doing something with this technology? You could change the world." And his buddies who were trying to, arrange a negotiation of some kind were trying to quiet him down. Don't be so excited. But it was really clear to him that we were never really going to do anything with this. By that I mean, you know, the kinds of revolutionary things that he was envisioning. The irony was, when they left, we'd still shown them only like 1% of what PARC was doing. But it was enough that they got really excited and decided they were going to retarget the Lisa to be something like what they had seen in terms of graphical user interface. They fell in love with the mouse, and that changed everything. And 7 months after that, I was working at Apple.